Yep, thank you very much. That's quite an introduction. I don't know whether I should thank you, actually, because that's a big ask. But as Tom said, all I've tried to do is look at this huge subject. It's massive. Behavioural economics is really an umbrella term to describe a whole range of ideas and principles. And there's so many of them, there's so much to each of them. But I've tried to sort of distill it down to what I think are some of the key principles and then some of the interesting principles. And I suppose this 15 minutes is like a little treatise for me to say, look, behavioural economics is absolutely fantastic. It's really accessible, really, really interesting. It's something we can all benefit from knowing about, both personally, because we'll spot those distortions or mistakes that we might be making in our thinking, but also in terms of what we do, particularly in the digital space, where we're perhaps creating things that eventually will go in front of consumers. And if we understand a little bit more about human beings and how they think and the decisions they make, it can be so beneficial. And behavioural economics is wonderful. It packages it so neatly. It frames it in such a way that it's really easy to understand and very, very relevant for what we all do. And it works a lot like a visual illusion. Dan Ariely, who's my sort of favourite behavioural economist because he's very witty and very accessible, and he's written a brilliant book called Predictably Irrational. He uses the metaphor of a visual illusion to understand behavioural economics and what it is. So if we look at this diagram here, I hope you would agree with me that by and large A and B look like they are different coloured squares. But actually, when I reveal the next chart, you can see they're in fact the same colour. So it's just a trick, a visual illusion. And what's going on there is that if you take vision, it's one of the things that we are, one of the best things that we do. There's a huge part of our brain dedicated to it. We do it all the time. We're kind of made to do vision. And yet we can still make mistakes like this, even with something that we're so attuned to, that we're evolutionarily designed to do. And I guess the idea here is, or the metaphor for behavioural economics, is that if we can get that wrong, what about other things that we're not evolutionarily designed to do? Maybe choose a mortgage, maybe make a purchase of a new TV. So I want to share with you a few examples of these cognitive illusions or mistakes that we make. One of them is called anchoring bias. And this is quite an interesting one. And it's the idea that when we make a decision, we tend to anchor or rely on one specific piece of information, a reference point or a value, and then adjust from that point. Quite often it relates to an early experience, for instance, what we first paid for a new product, what we first paid when we bought a new car, and we'll tend to anchor onto that price and adjust up and down from it. And Dan Ariely did a really interesting experiment to prove that anchoring works, that it has an effect. And what he did, he took a class of students that weren't his students, he didn't sort of know them, and he said to them, right, first of all, I want you to look at your social security number, and I want you to write down the last 2 digits of that number. Okay, when you've done that, then he held up a bottle of good wine, and he said, imagine you're going to bid for this wine. I want you to write down how much you'd be prepared to bid for it, what sort of value you'd place on it. And when he analysed the results, what he found was the people who had written down the last 2 digits of their social security number, those with the higher numbers had bid a higher amount, and those with the lower numbers had bid a lower amount. And what it demonstrated, that even exposure to a number that has no relation whatsoever to that next task or that next product still had an effect. And in fact, this happened to me just earlier today on the way into Norwich. I stopped at the DIY store because I need to get a new electric screwdriver drill. Obviously to prove I'm a real man, but also because my other one's packed up. And I went to the store and I picked one up in a box, and I thought, that looks like the right thing. And I said to the guy selling, there's no price on it, can you tell me how much it is? And he said, oh, I think they're about 200 quid. And I was like, oh, okay, a bit more than I was willing to pay. And then he came back and said, oh no, I made a mistake, actually 100. Well, by that point, I'd anchored on £200. So 100 looked like a real bargain. So, and I read this stuff and I still do it. And actually, seeing this in action is incredible. Just one example of where it can be used or how it's used. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it happens. When they launched the iPad, Apple, shall we say, allowed it to be thought that the iPad was going to be at a price point of $999 in the US. In other words, they probably fed it. Oh gosh, I'm on film. No, I'm sure they didn't feed it out. But anyway, they allowed it to be assumed that it would be. And then when Steve Jobs stood on the stage, the big price point came up on the screen, $999, and suddenly crashing through it, $499. Well, of course, by that point, everyone had anchored to $999, so $499 seemed like an absolute deal. But it does have a serious point here as well, which is whenever we're exposing people, because it's particularly around numbers that seems that we're quite sensitive, whenever we're exposing people to a number like this, let's say, on a website, if there's a range of sort of cost options or something, be aware that those numbers will have an impact, and people could anchor to the higher or lower number on there. It could have an effect. Herd instinct and social norms, another principle of behavioural economics. We're social creatures. We follow others. It's in our DNA. We assume that intelligence lies with the mass, the idea that all those people can't be wrong. We don't want to be left out, and we do want to fit in. And that provides another shortcut, another way for us not to have to think too hard. And of course, it's got the added bonus that if it turns out to be the wrong decision, we can blame other people. So it's win-win. And that, again, that can be used to great effect in marketing and communications. It can increase people's likelihood to vote. I mean, again, I seem to be Apple obsessed, but I just happened to notice their most recent ad campaign for the iPhone. It very much focused on, all the things you can do as part of a community. All these people can do it, and you can't. So obviously tapping into a bit of loss aversion there as well. But it can be quite powerful in driving decision-making and even behaviour change. I think last year the census, they sent letters out to people, so rather than saying, send your census in or we're going to fine you, they actually said, did you know you're one of the last in your street to complete it? And it's a social norm, and it appealed to the social animal within us. So it was quite powerful in encouraging us to act. Similarly, it could be argued that Selfridges have got their bright yellow bags up and down Oxford Street. They're very visible. It's kind of social proof that buying there is both safe and desirable. And on Amazon, you can't fail to notice X% of people went ahead and bought this item. I know that I find that terrifically reassuring, and my brain says, well, they must be right, mustn't they? So I better do the same. And so it goes on. But it's a powerful lever, and it can be a quick and easy way of reassuring us that we're making the right decision. Choice architecture is another key principle of behavioural economics. This is the idea that there's in fact no neutral way to present a choice, that we're actually influenced by the way options are presented to us, and when the context change, or the order of the choice, or the layout of the choice, so does the decision we make. It could be something simple. I mean, there's experiments that have been done in cafeterias where, one day they've laid cakes out very prominently, and sure enough, the sales shoot up, and the next day, fruit goes out, and it's very prominent, and sure enough, the sales of fruit go up. So, the idea that we're just wandering and finding the thing that's just right for us is a nonsense. We are influenced by what we see in front of us, how it's displayed, how it's placed. And actually, we've got to kind of assume that we're all choice architects. Every time we present something to someone else, client or customer, it will be a designed choice. And it's one that we can influence to ensure, shall we say, that the right choice is made. There's a great example of this that Dan Ariely came up with. He was looking on the Economist website, and he noticed that the subscriptions had three options. There was the online-only option, the print subscription, which is $59, the print subscription, $125, and print and web subscription was $125. And he thought, that's a bit strange. I wonder why those two are the same price when, very clearly it's a bit of a no-brainer. For the same price, you can get print and web, you'd go for that. And sure enough, he tested it with his students or a group of students, and the results came back, and they showed overwhelmingly that 84% wanted or suggested that they would go with the print and web subscription. So he did a little experiment. He took that middle one out because he thought, well, if no one wants it, what's the point of it? What's it doing there? But very interesting what happened when he took it away, the results were reversed, and 68% went with the online only. And what this demonstrates, I want to go into the where's and how that's happened, but what it demonstrates is that relative to other options, it reflects on them, and it helps people make a decision about what seems a good choice. And that's another central principle of behavioural economics, that we use relativity to help us make a decision. We're always comparing one thing with another, not consciously though. And the context in which we see things have such a profound effect. There's so many great examples. I mean, from buying houses to the great ones probably have its own award one day, is the bread maker. So they launched the bread maker, do the research, everyone's saying, yeah, we'd love to be able to make bread at home. So they launched the bread maker, and it doesn't sell. And they do a bit more research, and what they find is that people feel a bit anxious about buying what is a new product. It's about 40 years ago in the States. It's a new product, they don't know much about it, and it's relatively high price point. So they launch a dummy version, 50% more expensive, and suddenly the original starts to sell in great numbers. And what happened there was that people could look at that and say, well, I don't know much about bread makers, but I know that one is cheaper than that one. So it gave them a decision that they felt they could make. And that's kind of what all this is about. It's about presenting things in such a way that we feel, well, we don't have to be an expert in it, but it feels like a decision we can make, and it feels like a good decision. Another principle of behavioural economics is heuristics, not to be confused with usability heuristics, but heuristics are really experience-based strategies, shortcuts that we all use all the time to speed up the decision-making process. And again, we're barely aware that we're doing these, so very hard to identify. Brands, of course, are the ultimate heuristic. You know, these are like the mental shortcuts that make potentially complex decisions quite simple for us. You know, they speak to the cognitive miser in us. We don't want to have to think really hard about absolutely everything. And it might be, you know, Tesco Finest is a shortcut to quality. Marks and Spencer's Living Well is a shortcut to healthy. There's the recognition heuristic, you know, something we recognise or that's familiar. It's got a greater value than something that's not. There's dozens of these heuristics, and they're all really interesting. I mean, a great list of them, but I always refer to them all the time. They're really interesting to get to know what those shortcuts can be. And they're being added to all the time, of course. And finally, cognitive biases. I find these are the most interesting. And again, like heuristics, there's a burgeoning, growing list of them. All sorts of things that come into this. And these are the inherent thinking errors that we make in processing information, and they result fundamentally in irrational decision making. For example, loss aversion. As human beings, we feel a loss much more strongly than we feel a gain. And I don't know if any of you can recall any examples of this, but I know, for example, if I've been overcharged, as I was, about £5 by my mobile phone provider, I wasted a good 45 minutes trying to get that £5 back, because it kind of hurts and I wanted it back. Now, if that mobile phone provider had given me £5, I wouldn't have felt the benefit nearly as much as the loss hurt. So it actually has a greater impact. But what's interesting is that can be identified and that can be used. So, for instance, rather than saying to people, if you want to encourage people to use low energy light bulbs, for example, rather than saying to them, you know, use low energy light bulbs and save £100 a year, maybe it's actually use low energy light bulbs or you will lose £100 a year, because the loss is much more powerful. And loss aversion can result in inertia. We see it in personal finances. If someone makes an investment and it starts losing in value, they won't cash it in. They'll hang on to it for dear life. They don't want to realise that loss. I know, because I do this all the time. And it's a desire to sort of, you know, stick to things. It's like a cognitive nudge pressing us not to make changes, even when they're actually in our own best interest. And that's also called status quo bias, and that's that we like things that fundamentally stay the same and they're familiar. If you all go for a quick break, chances are when you come back you'll pick the same seats. And that's status quo bias, very simply in action, that we kind of like what things to stay the same, be familiar. So it just proves this idea that we're in control of the decisions we make is really an illusion. We've all got biases hardwired into our brains, and whether we like it or not, they influence how we make decisions. We're subject to giving different answers to the same questions, asked or framed differently. We're risk averse, which leads us to walk away from a better deal. We're overly attracted to short-term reward. We make decisions that are good enough, and our decision making is filled with shortcuts, which we all use, and we're only partially self-aware. So we're basically a bit of an irrational nightmare and mostly unaware of it. And I guess the idea is, you know, how can anyone be rational in a world where knowledge is limited, time is pressing, and deep thought is an unattainable luxury? Much of it stems from the fact that we're kind of cognitive misers. We just don't want to have to think too hard. You know, we're always going to do whatever's easiest to us. Anything that involves brain activity, more brain activity than normal, it makes us tired. Don't want to do it. So we'll always choose the path of least resistance. So it really sounds like I'm setting up human beings to be really hopeless. It's not the case at all. We're brilliant in so many ways, but fallible. But here's the rub. None of us really see ourselves as irrational in our decision making. We all feel we make the right choices for very sound reasons. And that's because, as I said, those shortcuts that we use, those biases that are acting on our decision making, we're only partially self-aware of them. So if I meet you, you know, the day after you've purchased a new TV, you might give me what you think are the reasons that you made that choice. But the chances are they won't be. And it misses out this myriad environmental and emotional factors that might be at play. You know, behavioural economists in their experiments have proved time and time again we're heavily influenced by what other people do, by what we first learn about something, by the experience-based shortcuts we use, by the way information is presented, by the way goods are displayed, or even just the mood we're in at the time. There's so much else going on there. It's the idea that I could say to you, why did you do that? And you'd be able to give me a reason is a nonsense. And actually, to paraphrase Rory Sutherland, he's the outgoing president of the IPA and a champion of behavioural economics, he suggests that the conscious rational brain isn't the Oval Office making executive decisions, it's more like the press office issuing reasons for those decisions. We don't really know how and why we do what we do.